Welcome to my live session today. And I wanted to go ahead and present some information about the writing process and how that can successfully help you to polish your work as you need to. So tonight I wanted to focus on writing for college and why it's different perhaps from some of the other writing that you might have done in the past. Now, for a lot of people, writing for college obviously is a much different style from what many people are used to. Maybe some of you are used to writing in the workplace, writing things like memos or, bullet points or outline type things for your boss or that kind of thing. So, writing for college kind of takes those rules and goes in a little bit of a different direction. So, let's take a look at some of the things that I see that people trip up on when it comes to this kind of thing. Number one, first and foremost, and I think a lot of people do know this, is a lot of people write the way that they speak, which, from a business standpoint, with the exception of being perhaps a little more formal when it comes to talking to your boss or other people of that nature, you probably won't want to use things like slang, for example, and you probably won't you want to use things like acronyms or abbreviations because not everybody is familiar with those types of things. As an example, okay, I worked for an attorney once upon a time, and he was an older gentleman, and he may not be as savvy to some of the slang and the acronyms that we all know. So, for example, if you said LOL, he may not have any idea what you're talking about here. Pardon me. Likewise, if you put slang in there, he may or may not catch that. So that's important, especially when you're writing in a business context, because as you may know, or maybe not, different cultures have different language characteristics. And as such, understanding those language characteristics can go a long way to preventing you from being embarrassed. So, for example, if you are dealing with people, say, in Japan, they are not necessarily going to use the same types of language patterns and speech patterns that we do. So, automatically assuming that they use the same kind of slang and language that we do is not a good assumption because that's going to end up possibly creating a situation where, at best, you'll be misunderstood, and at worst, you might unintentionally, insult somebody, which nobody wants to do. So, it's a good idea to kind of be prepared on the front end for those types of things. Likewise, don't write in fragments. What's a fragment? A fragment is an incomplete sentence. So if I said, while reading the paper, okay, well, who's reading the paper? We don't know. It doesn't tell us. So that's a fragment. Generally, a fragment is going to be missing a subject, a verb, or both. And as a result of missing those items, your audience is going to be left going, what in the world am I reading? So don't do that because that's going to serve only to confuse them. And especially if it's a fragment and you're not quite sure if the sentence that came before it is what it's talking about or not. So use complete sentences, use standard written English, and right off the bat, you're off to a good start. And this is a good practice for workplace writing as well as academic writing. So that can help you to be prepared on the front end. Pardon me. Academic writing, you've probably heard me say this already, but I do reiterate it again because a lot of people, myself included, do tend to slip into this. Try to avoid using second person you and first person I as a rule. Reason being, and I'll explain why. A lot of the time, what ends up happening is if you use you sound like you're ordering people about. So if I said, you need to read this book, it sounds like I'm commanding you to read the book. You don't want to come across as bossy in academic writing. You also don't want to use first person except sparingly, because generally speaking, academic writing is a little bit different from workplace writing in that you want to remain objective. And by remaining objective, you sound impartial and you sound like you'll be able to examine the topic, present all the information factually, and then let readers make up their minds as to how they feel about what you're presenting. And that's a good approach because, especially in academic writing, you may end up having to have people, if you are presenting something, you're going to touch on topics that maybe some people don't like, or maybe some people don't agree with your views. As an example, I noticed in last week's discussion, we had a couple people touch on some touchy topics. One of them, and I'm not going to get too into it because I don't want to start a battle, but a touchy topic can be obvious ones like politics. Those are very hot button. All I have to do is mention the word, and usually people are off to the races, already starting to battle over it. So obviously, that's one that you want to touch lightly because you don't want to make your audience angry and alienate them right from the jump, especially if they don't necessarily agree with your view. You want them to pay attention and listen because you want to present the information and let them determine how they're going to react to it. So that's important. And by remaining objective, you are able to touch on some of the more volatile topics without sounding like you have an agenda to push. You guys have probably seen this already, but if you watch TV, even only sparingly, you've probably seen things like commercials. I know that Super Bowl we just had the other day had some commercials going on. And let's face it, the commercials are cute, they're funny. A lot of the time, they're entertaining in some ways, even if they just make you roll your eyes at how silly they are. But their main agenda is to sell a product. Their main agenda is to part you from your money. And because of that, what they want to do is they want to dress that up, of course. They're not going to come right out and say, hey, give me your money. But they're going to try to make it seem like, hey, if you buy this product, you're going to turn into Morgan Freeman and dance like Fred Astaire. So they make it so it looks good and they draw audiences in before you even realize you've been drawn in. And obviously, they're going to have a slant or a bias or an agenda because they're trying to sell you a product. Now, if I'm not trying to sell you anything and I'm not trying to push my own personal belief or agenda, that would make me objective. And even if I have a personal belief on the topic, kind of putting it back a little bit and giving both points of view on the topic and then kind of easing my own ideas in there at the end is a good way to go when you're touching on topics like this. That way, you've covered the waterfront, you've touched on the items you need to touch on, nobody gets offended really, and you get on out gracefully. So, not a bad way to go when you think about it. Likewise, you don't want to be inconsistent in tense or person, and you don't want to use things like ya, wanna, gonna, and you don't want to end verbs with en or in or I instead of ing. So like waiting, watching. I have people who do that for creative spelling purposes, and that's fine if you're in something like creative writing, where the rules kind of go out the window. But when you're writing academically as well as professionally, it's really best to put your best foot forward because your audience is going to come away from your work in both cases with not only an idea of what you wrote, but an idea about you. They're going to judge how they feel about you based on what they've read. So, are you a good person to take viewpoints from, or are they going to dismiss you because you've got a whole paper full of slang here? Which, don't get me wrong, that does have its place. If you pick up a lot of literature, whether it's modern or not, you'll notice that a lot of it is written reflecting slang and or language of the time. So it does have its place. This just isn't it. Okay. Likewise, pronouns and antecedents. So the pronouns take the place of a noun. Reason being, you don't want to say the same word over and over and over and over. Miss O'Connor said this. Miss O'Connor did that. Miss O'Connor said this. Miss O'Connor did that. No, it's better to go ahead and say, okay, pronouns take the place of a noun. So Miss O'Connor did this and she did that. So now notice how she takes my name out of there and puts in a different word. The reason for that is so that we can vary language and the reader doesn't fall asleep hearing my name 900 times. So ideally, you want to stay consistent with that. So in my sample sentence, I have Mary went to the store and she bought candy. I wouldn't say Mary went to the store and he bought candy because that would confuse your audience because they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, who is this person and where did he come from? Okay. Pardon me. Mechanical rules. you don't want to start off with a number, write the word out. Okay? Numbers below 100 should be spelled out. So, for example, 87. You're going to want to write the words out, okay, instead of just writing the letters. Okay? So that's pretty easy. Here are some commonly misspelled words. I do recommend that if this is something that trips you up, first of all, if this is something that trips you up, don't feel too bad. Okay? Because a lot of people, and I do mean a lot of people, stumble on these. So if you are one of the people who stumbles on these, count yourself in good company because there's a lot of other people out there just like you who trip on these. It's okay. Don't let it stop you. Don't be daunted. Okay? That's super important as well. I cannot stress to you how important it is just to not get discouraged. I know sometimes it's easier said than done. You know, you got a lot going on in your lives and you're trying to juggle maybe family, children, older parents, job or jobs, significant others, you name it. Lots of stuff going on. So it's a lot to handle. But guys, I really want to stress to you, even though it's really, really easy to get disillusioned and want to give up, please don't let yourself go there because you do have wiggle room. You do have leeway. Okay? So don't necessarily say, well, this is it, I'm up the creek and I don't have a paddle. If these are words that you tend to misspell all the time, so much the better. You know why? When you start doing your proofreading, when you look your stuff over, if you know that these are words you always trip on, start your proofreading there. Look at those words and automatically start going through your work and looking for those words to find out where you can maybe tweak those and correct them accordingly. It's actually a really good strategy if you know that that's something that trips you up because you can then target the items that trip you up and tackle them as you need to. So you actually have an advantage by knowing what your disadvantages are. That's actually a really good thing, guys. I have students where they come into my writing class. Let me tell you, they come into class and they are happy to tell me, in no uncertain terms, everything that they do incorrectly in English before I even look at anything of theirs. I may have no idea who they are or what their names are even yet, and they haven't even handed in their first assignment, and they're telling me, well, I can't spell, and I can't use a comma, and I can't do this, and I can't do that. Well, by knowing all those things up front, go ahead and prep accordingly because that'll help you when you're going ahead and polishing up that paper. Okay? Unnecessary repetition is another one that I have students do sometimes, and the reason for that is usually if I give a word count. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but I have students where if I say, for example, okay, guys, I want you to write 500 words. That's 2 typewritten double-spaced pages. Okay? So that's a 2-page paper. Now, if I said to them 500 words, well, a lot of people get very panic stricken because they're writing their papers and they get to word 492 and they don't know what to put for those last 8 words. So they start panicking and then they start filling in stuff like this, like a round circle or the past history. You know, obviously, you don't need to put those extra words in. History generally happens in the past. Circles generally tend to be round. No need to pad your word count with that type of stuff. But I do have students where they panic because they feel that the instructor is going to come after them if they don't have the actual word count that's necessary. And I actually have worked with instructors where that was the case. I worked with one person where actually, if you didn't have 500 words on the dot, she would downgrade you. And she would downgrade you if you were at 492. She would downgrade you if you were at 501. If you were 500 on the dot, you were good to go. So it was a little bit of a balancing act working with that. I don't pay as much attention to the word count in that sense, as long as the content meets the needs and as long as you are generally within the bounds of the word count. So in other words, for example, if I said to you, write 500 words and you hand in a page paper, obviously you've fallen short because one typewritten page is usually around 250 words. So you've only met about half the protocol for the assignment. Now, if you're most of the way down page 2, that's going to be fine. But if you hand in a paragraph and it's a 500-word essay, you're obviously falling short, and you would need to revisit that or change your topic or your content accordingly. Okay? Some items to avoid also. The first one is a little pet peeve of mine. A lot. People tend to write it A-L-O-T. So you want to split that up and make it 2 words, as in, I have a lot of homework. So separate those. Try to avoid starting sentences with a contraction, or a conjunction rather. So and, for, nor. Avoid contractions in research writing and, formal academic writing. Why? It sounds informal. The lady I just mentioned who was 500 words or bust, if you used a contraction in your paper, she would also take off points. So it was very important to kind of keep an eye on your content along with everything else. There's also no such words as their self, his self, and all right written as it is here. All right should be 2 words. Use who when referring to people. So there was someone that made me happy. People are who because they're people. And the last bullet point is also a pet peeve of mine. So the party would of or have made me happy. What people get confused on there is they're used to making that a contraction. So apostrophe VE is usually what they put in there to kind of combine would and have for would have. Well, that's what that sounds like when you speak. So lo and behold, you got would of. However, that's not how it's written. So bear that in mind when you're writing, because otherwise you're going to end up with a problem in your papers. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and pause here. Basically, we have the parts of speech, which I think a lot of you are already familiar with, so I'm not going to browbeat you too hard. But generally, believe it or not, I know this seems really, really elementary, but understanding each of these items and understanding the role that they play in sentences and in writing will actually take you a long way in being able to construct your sentences appropriately. So make sure you know what's what. So what's a noun and what's a verb, and how do you spot them in your sentence? Bearing that in mind, how can you make sure that they match one another? And how can you make sure that they match your content appropriately? So all those things are important when you're constructing your papers. Alrighty, I appreciate your time. I hope that was a little bit helpful for you. And I have another one that I'm gearing up to talk about for the Remington Library. That's probably going to be one of my next ones. I've had a lot of people asking about that one. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.